Yo, it's your boy Logos, and today I want to react to my favorite content creator for the past year and a half now, Rendagoon. He often talks about conspiracy theories, mysteries, and other stuff that I find interesting, and I finally found a good excuse to talk about him on the channel. Today he discusses Japanese war crimes and the experiments they did on the people, including POWs, civilians, and soldiers, and how most of the people, or really none of the people that was experimented on, survived. I haven't watched this video yet because I know it's going to be grisly, because I know a little bit about Japanese war crimes. I listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History about the Pacific War in the theater and all the horrible stuff that happened. Some things included bayoneting babies, putting babies at the end of knives, and that's what a bayonet is. A bayonet is just a knife at the end of a gun, basically. I'm very much oversimplifying it, but the whole point is Japanese would put babies at the end of those, kill them, do graping of women and children, all types of evil stuff. Some stuff I don't even want to repeat because I don't want to cause you to just go up or just want to turn off the video right now. But if you're interested in this type of stuff, I really think it will be interesting to you, and I think it's going to be interesting to me. Even though I don't like grisly stuff, I still watch war, I study war, and I love it. So hopefully I can bring something into this that isn't within, other reaction channels. Let's get into it.
When discussing humanity's history and tales from our past, it's often comforting to look at those stories through a lens of superiority. After all, in the modern age, people have more information and are more connected to each other than they ever have been before. So when we look back at tragedies and atrocities that people have committed, it's easy to apply a label of ignorance and just say that they weren't in the same position that we are now, so it makes sense that they did the things they did. But regardless of any label or explanation that you could come up with, it's hard to justify the evils of Unit 731. Unit 731 was officially a public health department within Japan during World War II. Although now we know, as the years have revealed, Unit 731 was in actuality perhaps the most disturbing case of human experimentation ever. The actions that Unit 731 did for the perseverance of a country and an idea is hard to imagine any person doing for whatever selfish reason, much less the entire efforts of a military and government. So today, we're going to talk about the history and tragedy of Unit 731, as well as the incredible injustice that befell everything in the end. Now, before we get started, I just want to mention that while I am going to be careful with my language and not be too explicit with some of my wording or details, the topics we're going to be broaching still relate to intense violence against women, children, prisoners of war, civilians, and all manner of executions, both standard and barbaric. And while I do think it's important to talk about these things, not only for the victims who were destroyed by this tragedy, but also so that the evils that were done by man are never forgotten lest they be repeated, and while I think all that's important, I also want to say that if you are sensitive to these topics, it's not worth your own health and mentality. So again, if this video is something that you don't want to deal with, or if some of the topics that I briefly mentioned are too intense, feel free to click off now. And also, for those who are sticking around, the video is going to be a bummer. There's not a lot of jokes or fun to be had with this one. Like I said, I think it's important to talk about, but it's just going to be sad and a lot. And I can't wait to get done filming this so that I don't have to think about it anymore and I can just push all this trauma onto you all. Before we get into that, and it's just, sad for the next half hour, however long this video is, why not do something a little quirky, a little weird right now to kind of lighten the mood a bit? Like, I don't know, maybe I could try to
Sponsorship.
radicalize my audience. So with that out of the way, let's get into something that really matters. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. But, do you know what hasn't been a disaster? Raid Shadow Legends! Raid is back and better than ever because now they're bringing the new animated limited series, Raid Call of the Arbiter. A series that you can watch for free in-game right now. The first episode is out now. It revolves around the character of Gaelic, and from the animation to the character arcs that they're building, they really use the fantasy setting for all it's worth. The series is really shaping up to be something special. New episode.
Listen, I don't play mobile games anymore. I haven't played them since like high school, but if you were into it, I heard Raid Shadow Legends pretty good. And honestly, I think what I've heard, they're pretty good with the sponsorships. Like the people they sponsor, they compensate them well. Very understanding with schedules and stuff. So I'm happy for them. So you got the sponsorship, you're getting that money. Hopefully, if you like Raid Shadow Legends, you could just, take a little picture now if you haven't seen this video already. But I truly don't give a shit about Raid Shadow Legends. I honestly never will because it ain't me. So I'm just gonna,
In the video, it really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. QR code and link in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So the history of Japanese warfare and the Japanese government that led up to the creation of Unit 731 is pretty extensive, but I want to keep it to what's relevant to the events of World War II. To set the stage, in 1925, the Geneva Convention banned the use of biological and chemical weapons. This was done because during World War I, one of the most brutal parts of trench warfare was the use of chemical weapons. And while this treaty deterred several nations from using it altogether, not every nation was in agreement with the Geneva Convention, one of these being Imperial Japan.
if you're interested in learning more about World War One and the use of biological weapons, no horrors that it caused for those men that was fighting in those trenches, I implore you to go and check out Dan Carlin's Hardcore History when he talks about the blueprint for Armageddon. That just talks about the whole Great War, World War One, and it's very, very grisly. But he talks about the stories of the soldiers. He puts you in their shoes as best he can, and does with a lot of respect. And it's also like what 12 hours long, maybe 15 hours. So for someone like me, that just means more content, more knowledge. So if that interests you, definitely go check that out because it's very, very good, very high quality.
Now, as you're going to see in a moment, Imperial Japan was not one to shy away from brutality. And as it related to chemical and biological weapons, them being banned didn't mean they weren't going to use them, it just meant they were going to be very careful about how they used them. And during the 1930s, Japanese researchers began to dig into the possibilities of biological warfare. To make sure we're all on the same page, by biological warfare in this context, I'm referring to things like weaponizing diseases, or using infections as a battle implement. The issue with this was, or at least the issue from the Japanese government's perspective, is it's hard to test the feasibility or practicality of biological weapons if you don't have a population or group of people to test said weapons on. Also during the 1930s, Japan began to attack the mainland of China. At this time in history, China was really struggling to reach the modern age, at least technologically, and a lot of their defensive forces were made up of small communities and bands of soldiers, whereas in opposition to them, Japan had an incredibly strong military force.
Also, at the same time, from my memory, China was going through like a civil war. Half was like the communists, and I think the other half was like some type of maybe democratic or other type of republic type of government. But yeah, there was also fighting within themselves. They had the Japanese swooping in and, taking care of them. And by taking care of, I mean, invading, killing, conquering, exploiting, and then using them for these experiments. It's really sad and messed up. But having a civil war, then finding a more technologically advanced civilization, I mean, it's really put China on the back foot. And honestly, they probably would have fell, or maybe not fall completely, but they would have lost a lot more ground if it wasn't for American help and American interests. But not just America, you have British, you have all the allies. Because from my memory, British had, colony cities like Hong Kong and such and so forth.
So most of the conquest of China is called a conquest because the Chinese would try to put up the best fight they could, but would just keep getting destroyed by the Japanese government at every turn. So we see all these pieces moving on the board. Japan is interested in biological and chemical warfare, and they're starting to make headway into the Chinese mainland. And again, this is all like a decade before World War II would even begin. Around this time, the Japanese Surgeon General named Shiro Ishii came forward and said that Japan needs to make headway into biological warfare because everyone could tell a war was on the horizon, and if Japan doesn't get to it first, then one of the other powers, like the United States, might beat them to it. The Japanese government, being in agreement at this concept of a biological arms race, in 1932 appointed Ishii as the head of the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory. Publicly, the purpose of this laboratory was to investigate cures for illnesses and diseases that could befall a military force, when in actuality, they were trying to find new ways to make illness befall a military force. This group also had a division within part of the Japanese-controlled area of China. The unit there in China was known as the Togo Unit and was a part of this biological warfare initiative. Something else to keep in mind whenever we talk about this. So at this point in history, Imperial Japan was especially prejudiced against anything that wasn't Imperial Japan. A lot of the ideas that were made manifest through these experiments and Japan's actions in World War II come from a cultural sense of superiority. As a matter of fact, a superiority that's so strong, it justifies taking over and controlling everyone else. Because of that, several members of the Japanese government and military saw anyone who opposed them as less than human, or at least less than Japanese. And if you'll remember what I mentioned earlier, it's hard to test biological weapons without test subjects. So the Togo unit decided early on that the perfect way to test these new weapons and ideas was with residents of mainland China. Initially, this research was carried out at a location known as the Zongma Fortress. The fortress was an old castle-like structure that was built in Manchuria, China, and was repurposed for the Togo unit's needs. The early experiments at the Zongma Fortress typically consisted of bringing in civilians from mainland China and throwing them in the various rooms of the fortress that were converted into prison cells. Inside of these cells, initially, the subjects would be fed well and kept up to good health, and then at that point, the experimentation could begin. Taking these now healthy test subjects, the researchers would then do things like slowly bleed them out over the course of several days, or dehydrate or starve them to see what the effects of the body would be and how long the subject could survive.
I just want to go back just a little bit. I'm not going to physically go back, but what he talked about before about Imperial Japan seeing other people, including other Asian people, as less than, if not Imperial Japan, it's just crazy too because they had this whole propaganda thought or machine out saying they wanted to kick out the Western yoke from Asia and have a greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. They wanted to be the leader for Asian freedom and Asian economic power and not be, under colonization anymore. That's the message they put out there as they got ready to invade these countries like the Philippines and such and so forth. And they did nothing but exploit them, kill civilians, because at the end of the day, they really need these resources. That's why they invaded China. That's why they invaded all these other places. Like the Philippines, from my memory, had like rubber. And, China's so big, so huge, pause. But they have a whole bunch of resources. But Japan, they try to make it seem like they want to help these people. But once they get there, they just kill them and hurt them. Really sad.
Again, this was all done in the name of better understanding the limits of the human body. During the course of these tests, they would also be subjected to various diseases like the bubonic plague, and at various stages of infection, the subjects would be vivisected, or a live dissection, most often while the subject was still conscious. This was done to see firsthand what the effects of certain diseases do to someone's internal system. These experiments would pale in comparison to what this group of researchers would go on to do. Things were kind of tenuous at the Zongma Fortress. Again, at this point, it's a group of researchers, not soldiers, who are doing this. And while a part of the Japanese government, it isn't a one-to-one with the Japanese military. So because of that, there were a few accidents that occurred at the facility. In 1934, there was a prison break, and a bunch of the prisoners escaped out into the Chinese countryside. In 1935, there was an explosion, and a large part of the fortress was burnt. But in spite of these incidents, the Japanese government liked the concept of these new means of warfare. So in 1936, the Japanese government gave them more funding and more access to military reserves, which not only included a lot of money, but things like Japanese soldiers for guard duty, or Japanese prisoners for experimentation. When Shiro Ishii's group, which again at the time all of this was referred to as the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, whenever that group was brought into the Japanese government, it was renamed by Hirohito as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. So again, a word to imply to the public that the group's entire purpose is to make sure that everyone's safe. It was at this point that Ishii's group was officially given the designation of Unit 731. The group then focused all of their efforts into China because, again, that's where most of the test subjects were coming from. But instead of going back to the Zongma Fortress, they now went to a brand new Japanese military research facility. This facility was a massive complex that had over 150 buildings and encompassed over 2 square miles. One of the fascinating things to note about the structure of the building is there was this large welcome center or area that supposedly anyone who enters the complex has to go through, but that was actually a fake building that was just done for publicity purposes, because in actuality there was an underground tunnel that they would shuttle prisoners in and out of outside of the public view. So not only was the name and purpose of the facility a lie, but the actual structure and some of the buildings of the facility were a lie as well, as the majority of experiments took place in these underground tunnels and cells. Now, into the late 30s, as Japan began to take over more of China, there were other facilities that began to pop up that were also a part of Unit 731, but the primary experiments and travesties that happened took place at this large facility located near Pingfang. And by 1939, Unit 731 consisted of over 10,000 individuals. Now, not all of these 10,000 members were a part of human experimentation. You gotta understand, Unit 731 is encompassing the way diseases could be treated, how diseases may be made manifest, and a lot of the experiments that were happening at these other facilities might have been legitimate or had some purpose other than torture. But as far as the events that happened at the primary facility we talked about, those were all pretty evil. The excuse for this large facility as to why they bring in so many Chinese prisoners and exist out here in the middle of the woods away from public eyes is that they were a part of lumber production. So the code name given to experiments that had to do with human experimentation was called Maruta, because Maruta is Japanese for logs. And it was kind of an in-joke in the facility that instead of referring to the prisoners and subjects as prisoners and subjects, they would be called logs. Like, for example, how many logs were cut down today? Or do the logs look healthy? This whole code word thing would keep up through a lot of Unit 731's research. For example, several of the researchers who performed the experiments on prisoners firsthand would publish their findings, but they would publish them saying that it was a long-tailed primate that they did it to, or in some instances even referring to these subjects as Manchurian monkeys. Again, the Japanese government knew what was happening, but the rest of the world didn't, and the Japanese government would prefer to keep it that way. A lot of the numbers vary, considering several researchers probably came and went during the height of World War II whenever these experiments were at their worst, but at least one point, Unit 731 had about 300 researchers as a part of the Maruta or human experiments at this primary facility. So, what kind of experiments were happening here at this primary facility of Unit 731 that I have been trying to put off talking about and talking about all the other aspects of it so I don't have to get to it? And why is it regarded by many to be the worst example of human experimentation, or by some, the worst example of government action against a population ever? So I guess I need to talk about that now. And this is your final warning. Click off if you don't want to hear about it, and I don't blame you. So let's start with how the prisoners got to the facility in the first place. As mentioned, the majority of the subjects were people from the Chinese mainland. While the majority of these were Chinese people, there were also several Russians and Mongolians and Koreans who were captured as well as several Japanese political prisoners who were transferred to the facility as well. They would be transported to the front of the facility in a vehicle that had no windows, so that if there ever was an escape or if they were ever let out for whatever reason, they couldn't testify where the facility is even located. And then once they got to the facility, they were bagged and taken to the aforementioned underground tunnels. From there, they were placed into an underground cell. Most of them on their way in would be given a vaccine for their own health upon entry, when in actuality they were being injected with various diseases, and the disease would change based on whatever study the researchers were currently carrying out. Exact estimates of how many people were taken prisoner are kind of nebulous. On the most conservative end of the spectrum, it's about 3,000, but that number could be as high as 30 or 40,000 people who were actually taken to the facility. However many the true number might be, no one ever survived the Unit 731 experiments. The reason no one's sure how many died in the first place, and it took so long for this information to come out, is because no one that ever walked into that building ever walked back out. So what happened to these prisoners? Well, the thing I mentioned that happened at the Togo facility, the stuff about them being made healthy just so they could be bled out and dehydrated, that was still happening, but that was the least of the prisoners' worries. The average lifespan of a prisoner at Unit 731 was about 2 months. If you were lucky, then you were killed quickly in one of the conventional weapon experiments. These experiments were exactly what they sound like. They would take several of the prisoners and place them in a courtyard. One of the things they would do is they would place people in rings at various distances from each other and then throw a hand grenade in the middle to see what lethality the grenade had out
Jesus
to these different
Christ.
rings of people. They would set people on fire with flamethrowers and see how long it took them to burn up. They would line up people in a straight row and then shoot them with rifles and pistols to see the penetration capability.
Oh my gosh, he just getting started. This is remind me of, I don't know if any of you guys or women have watched this show growing up, but Deadly as a Warrior it used to come up on Spike TV, and they would do similar experience with this, but not with actual people. It would be like pigs or like beef ribs or like big slabs of beef to like test penetration of swords, guns. They would put up like houses with fake people mannequins. They will use like gelatin torsos of actual humans, so it's not an actual human, but a torso with the consistency and organs of an actual human, and do similar stuff, shoot guns and all the types of stuff that he's saying. But Japanese said, screw that stuff. Who needs a pig when you got a prisoner of war or a civilian that you, I don't know, just picked out? Whoa, I don't know, it's just really sick. But another thing to think about too is this sickness wasn't just limited to this unit. Like, we love to talk about Japanese soldiers being, mind crazy, the banzai, kamikaze, stuff like that. But this evil stuff was going on for them too, outside of, kamikazes and stuff like that. They would test their swords on prisoners of war and they would just chop their heads off, cut their heads off. They would request other units or other, captains or colonels and stuff like that if they have any prisoners of war available that they can get so they can practice their new sword that they just have. They want to see how good it cuts, how smooth it is, how much force it takes. Like, it wasn't just this one unit doing sick shit in Japan. It was a whole culture. It came from like a warped meaning of the samurai allegiance to quote unquote duty and honor, even though the whole duty and honor thing wasn't really a thing they lived by. Similar to the knights, the European knights, where they say about chivalry and all that. Yeah, that's mostly bullshit. George R. R. Martin, his Game of Thrones depiction of knights is much more truthful compared to, I don't know, I can't remember what, I think courtly love and all that type of, fantasy, medieval idea that you get from stuff like Lord of the Rings. Like, that stuff is pure fantasy, which is why Lord of the Rings is fantasy. In real life, chivalry really didn't exist. That whole code of honor for a samurai really didn't exist. And the Japanese government warped that type of mindset to be what you could get with a banzai charge, a kamikaze dive into a ship. They just warped that mindset. It really is sad what it did to these people. That doesn't mean I feel bad for dropping an atomic bomb on them. I wish an atomic bomb wasn't created, but at the end of the day, you start a war, you can't really cry about how it's finished.
They would sharpen bladed weapons to various degrees to see how sharp a knife needed to be to fully cut through somebody. And of course, as mentioned, this was all done to participants who were fully awake and conscious of the death they experienced. And again, that's if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, then you were a part of the disease trials. So the disease trials were similar to the things mentioned in the Togo unit, where they would infect people with things like the plague and then dissect them while they're alive to see the various stages of infection within the body. But they had been doing the bubonic plague research for years at this point. Again, the time period we're talking about now is generally like 1940, 1941. So the plague research has moved on to much larger demographics. Again, a lot of the records of Unit 731 were destroyed at the end of the war, but from what we know, there was at least 12 field tests of things like the bubonic plague and 11 of them took place in Chinese cities. So Unit 731 researchers
Mm-hmm.
would deposit plague-infected fleas into the middle of a Chinese populace or infect their wells and homes with things like typhoid. And then these researchers would watch from a distance and then walk through these decayed cities in their sterile garbs, recording the number of casualties. At the very least, tens of thousands of people died immediately from these large-scale weapon tests. Entire countrysides of people were destroyed by infected fleas that were simply thrown out in a clay pot. Back at the facility, the feasibility of chemical and biological weapons was being tested as well. They would have prisoners stand out in fields wearing different layers of protection, from completely naked to normal clothes to gas masks and what have you, and then they would just bombard them with things like mustard gas or sulfur gas and see how long it takes them to die at whatever stage of protection they're in. Another thing that
And those deaths aren't clean. Well, obviously they're not clean, but it's stuff like, blood coming out of your eyes, your nose, your mouth, all types of stuff, like your organs just collapsing, and you're just doing that for everybody. It's really sad and messed up. If you want to hear more details, go check out Blueprint for Armageddon.
the researchers were interested in was weaponizing venereal diseases. So to do this, they purposefully infected a bunch of people with STDs. However, the injections of the STDs tended to not take properly, so as an alternative, male and female prisoners were led into cells and then at gunpoint forced to transfer the diseases. And as mentioned previously, at various stages of the disease's progression, the individual would be vivisected to see what it's doing to the body. And even all of that is within the realm of feasibility. As evil, as depraved, as monstrous as it is, you can wrap your head around the concept of, okay, well, if someone really, really believed that the people they were torturing aren't really people, and that this is all for the greater good, you can see a purpose, to them at least, they can see a purpose at the end of the tunnel as to why they're doing this, right? Well, that's before we get into what I can only describe as Machiavellian torture methods. Because sure, they're wanting to use new diseases in the war, so they gotta test those, right? But some of the other stuff they did was simply no other explanation than depravity, or at least none other than I can think of. So to just read off a few of the things that happened at Unit 731, and again, these are things that records were not destroyed of, and people would later confess to. So if it's possible, it is very likely that worse stuff than this happened as well. People were cut open while alive and had various organs removed before they were stitched back up to just see what would happen. So, for example, cutting out someone's lower GI tract to see how long it takes them to die from that, taking out someone's stomach and attaching their gut to their throat to see what that does. People had their limbs cut off, in some cases, to visualize how long it took for someone to bleed out. But in other cases, they would saw off both arms and then switch the shoulder that the arm was attached to just to see if the body could reattach it. People were placed inside of low pressure chambers and the pressure cranked up to see how long it took for things like their eyes to fly out or their chest to implode. People were hung upside down by ropes tied to their ankles to see how long it took them to die from blood pressure to the head. People had very large and heavy objects like crates and rocks dropped on them to see how much force it took to kill someone from being crushed. People were placed inside of...
I'm sorry, hold on, just give me a second. Damn. Like, the people just watching this, are they not on drugs like the Nazis did when they was killing innocent civilians and people just because they were Jewish or Russian or because they was communists, even though they're not like a soldier or part of the party? Like, were these people just sober doing all this evil shit? They just didn't give a fuck? Because I can't imagine you not being mentally scarred from seeing yourself inside out or seeing other people in a position that you could easily been in. It's so cold and heartless. Oh man, God. It's when you know they do it, but you don't know the details. It's easier, but when you hear the actual details and just some of the depravity, it just hit you like a truck. All right, let's Keep going.
centrifuges, and the speed ramped up until they were dead to see how much g-force it took to kill someone. And as depressing
Fuck.
as it is, I should also mention the fact that they determined that children had a lower tolerance to it than
Oh,
adults. People were
fuck.
given intravenous injections of
God.
things like horse blood and seawater, again, just to see what would happen. People had their limbs placed in very cold buckets of water until their limbs were removed,
What
and
the
according to
fuck?
researchers, it felt and sounded as if it was wood, and then the limb would either be crushed to see what the damage of a frozen limb that becomes injured might be. They were set on fire to see if anything could be recovered from that. They tested various ways to warm someone back up after they were frozen to that degree. According to Ishii himself, again the lead researcher, they did various experiments where they took babies that were under a month old and placed them in freezing water and freezing elements just to see how long it took them to die of hypothermia. I'm going to read this next one from an excerpt from Hal Gold. He wrote a book called Japan's Infamous Unit 731, which is a book breaking down this whole topic. And Hal says in one portion, it was said that a small number of these poor men, women, and children who became Marudas were also mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated themselves to death under the heat of several hot, dry fans. At death, the corpses would weigh only about a fifth of their normal body weight. And in some cases, they would just decapitate people and take notes about it. It really is bizarre the level of insanity this entails. Like, not only is it evil, but it's also so dumb, right? Like, if you just cut someone's head off, what are you even studying? Like I said, you know, of course it's evil. I'm not saying obviously that any of it was better than the others, but when a military tests a weapon, as evil as it is, you could think to yourself, okay, I understand why they did that, but some of these things, just like mummifying people, shattering their frozen limbs, leaving babies out to die, like, it's a strange debauchery. There's all
Oh,
these stories we
God.
hear about that, like when Rome fell, there were these big swinger parties and everyone would get high until they were dead, right? And a similar thing happened at the end of World War II in places like Nazi Germany. It's like they were like rapping on the gates of death, just going to go out in a blaze of glory.
I'm sorry, I gotta talk so I don't fucking lose it. What he says is even triple times true when you think about the fact Japan had no chance of winning this war. Like, maybe you can make the argument that if they somehow struck evil, like the mastermind of evil with the disease or weapon from these experiments, they could use it from the against the Americans and against the Allies. But even still, they they didn't do it. Clearly, that wasn't the point, or that didn't work out. So they kept doing these experiments for what? Like, seriously, when you know the history of the war, Japan had no shot. Their best option was literally what they did: a sneak attack, and then trying to conquer these lands that do have allies like the United States quickly before the United States can attack and retaliate. But even still, that didn't work out for them. But they still kept doing this horrible, evil stuff to innocent people. For what?
But
I'm sorry, but for what? Like, to say this is for the war effort? There was nothing that Japan could have possibly done at all, unless come up with like nukes themselves and had at the start of the war to put America on his ass from jump. But outside of that, but productivity alone, America was going to produce way more of everything: tanks, guns, artillery, shells, ammo, everything, trucks, so much. Shit, they did against the Germans. One famous or one funny slash famous quote is like, for every like one panther or one tiger, they would take out like 9 Shermans, but there will always be a 10th one there waiting to kill them. America just produce. It might not be in the same quality as everybody else, especially, German tanks, but even still, just the amount of numbers and the big territory of the United States, Japan had no shot. Russia, but I'm sorry, not Russia, Germany had no shot. If Germany had no shot after conquering and owning France and other territory, what the hell makes you think Japan had a shot? But they still did this stuff. Oh, fuck, I had to take a breath and drink some tea and fuck.
this was a group of scientists who did it for a couple decades. Like, how, or at least the intensity of it for 5 years, right? Like, we don't even have the excuse that they were about to die or they thought they were just going to bust hell wide open. Like, it was just a continuous, thought out evil with seemingly no purpose that was signed off by members of governments, military, and the scientific community. And that's what makes it so terrifying. Perhaps the worst fate of anyone in Unit 731, or I'll say definitely the worst fate, was of the pregnancy studies. So as mentioned, the average lifespan of someone in Unit 731 was about 2 months.
Let's do the worst.
That number is skewed a bit because a lot of people who got there were killed within the first week, and things like the weapon testing. The reason that the average comes out to 2 months is because several of the studies were women who were, similar to the STDs, forcefully impregnated by either another prisoner at gunpoint or by one of the guards themselves. Similar to the other diseases, a lot of them were dissected while alive at various points in their pregnancy just so they could look at how the fetus was developing. And in other cases, the women were effectively used as a breeding stock so that the researchers could have a fresh batch of infants for several of their tests, like the hypothermia test as mentioned earlier. And you know what gets me about...
Listen, it's really hard for me to feel bad about dropping that nuke on them. It's really hard. It's really hard. I'm not saying that people today, like, it's the same thing I say about in all the other videos. Just because somebody did something decades or hundreds of years ago doesn't mean I'm gonna hold a grudge against somebody today. But back then, like, hearing all this stuff and hearing more details, you're not going into details about more acts, more grisly stuff. He probably holding back a lot. Jeez, I hope well, I know, like, he's like a Sunday school teacher, so he probably, strong in his faith, and he probably got some peace for this. He probably prayed on it and stuff like that. But even still, like, it's really hard for me to feel bad about that nuke. I can't feel bad about either of those nukes. After hearing this,
about it, like, I've looked at so many disturbing things. As a matter of fact, I knew a lot about Unit 731 because I covered it on the disturbing movie Iceberg. There's a film that I should have looked up before I started recording. There's two of them. There's Philosophy of a Knife, which I talked about in the disturbing movie Iceberg, and Men Behind the Sun. Both of them go into graphic detail about what happened at Unit 731. So I had seen those, so I'm like, wow, I already knew that, the Japanese government did all of these evil things to these people. And I, knew about the frozen trials, knew about the chemical weapon trials, even things like the pregnancy experiments. So, like, I knew all of that going into research for this. But the part that threw me off, that I wasn't expecting that I would see, actually, believe it or not, came from Wikipedia. Typically, Wikipedia is a horrible source to get information from because people can just change stuff, and sometimes they just flat out make it up. But whenever I was brushing up for this, I decided I'd look at Wikipedia to see how they had it laid out. And they had an account that I hadn't read anywhere before that kind of stopped me in my tracks. There's at least one recorded instance of friendly social interaction between prisoners and Unit 731 staff. Technician Naokota Ishibashi interacted with two female prisoners. One prisoner was a 21-year-old Chinese woman, the other a Soviet girl who was 19 years of age. Ishibashi asked where she came from and learned that she was from Ukraine. The two prisoners told Ishibashi that they had not seen their faces in a mirror since being captured and begged him to get one. Ishibashi sneaked a mirror to them through a hole in the cell door. And that bothers me so much more than a lot of the other information I read. And the reason for that is because, again, I'm pretty desensitized to just brutality, right? Like, the number of historical stories I read about that has to do with people getting, skinned alive, or, brutal executions. Like, that's just history, right? It's bloody, it's brutal, Evil's always existed. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it is a lot easier to throw a label of ignorance on top of everything, right? Like, we take it for granted in the modern age because everyone's hyper connected by the internet, right? Like what you're watching this video on right now. And it's really easy for us to take human connection for granted. To just say, well, of course, I know that this other group of people is of equal worth as myself because I talk to them. I know several of them. I experience it. And it's easy to go in with that mindset and look at history and be like, oh, well, yeah, I could see how the Imperial Japanese would, be so tricked by their government because they just weren't as educated. They weren't as enlightened as we were, right? So it's easier to read stories about things like Unit 731 if you kind of turn your brain off and you're like, this was a group of people who just didn't see the others as human, and that's why these tragedies were allowed to happen. But then I read the story of a guard who saw two girls, young women, who wanted to remember what they looked like. And he recognized that they needed to feel something, that they needed to have that. So he broke rules and snuck them a mirror. And it made me cold. Because then it's not just a person who let themselves get tricked and convinced themselves that they were dealing with cattle, right? Even, which if these experiments were done with animals, I think we'd all still agree that it's evil and terrible.
Yeah.
But maybe that was his mindset, right? That he's just dealing with animals. But to read that he took pity on a girl who two girls who wanted to remember what they looked like terrified me, because at least some of them were fully aware that these people were suffering and that was wrong. Not just that they were suffering and this was for the greater good, but that they were suffering and something should be done. And in spite of that, it kept happening. It was such a powerful force of government and people and the greater good
And the culture.
that these tragedies kept going on, and the people who participated were well aware of the pain they were inflicting and didn't stop it.
Oh, here's another thing to consider. I mean, we already talked about mess up stuff, so let me just drop something else on top of it. This didn't just, like I said earlier, didn't just, restrict itself to, the crew and the experimentation crew. Japanese soldiers would tell Japanese civilians to kill themselves, blow themselves up, using hand grenades, throwing themselves off cliffs, excuse me, throwing themselves off cliffs, including their children, including their babies, killing themselves because they were so afraid of the Americans, saying the Americans was, rapists, and there was murderers, and they're gonna do massacres to them and harm them and do evil stuff to them. So they're convinced these Japanese civilians to do harm to themselves so the Americans wouldn't do it. Or if they caught a Japanese civilian trying to, surrender, and I say surrender as if they're like fighting, but not get in the middle of the war zone and go to the American side for safety and protection, Japanese soldiers and snipers would kill them. They would kill Japanese civilians, men, women, and children if they were seen going to the Americans because it was seen as, betrayal. So that's why I say it's a culture, because it's not just, it's brainwashing, it's indoctrination, it's so much horrible, messed up stuff. But yes, the culture has something to do with it because they did their own people like that. It wasn't just the Chinese people. If you fell out of line, it was that's probably why these soldiers was so afraid to do something, because it was seen as dishonorable. You're going against the emperor. Oh yeah, that's another thing too. He didn't mention it, but the emperor was seen as a little god, like a god emperor. That's how it was seen at that time in Japan. So they would use that excuse too, like this is the emperor. He wants you to do this. This is gonna help the war effort. You're gonna bring the Japanese sun to even higher heights. Like it's really messed up what they did to these people. And it reminded me a lot of the Nazi Germany experiments, the Nazi Germany stuff where they did with the concentration camps, or just straight up massacres, open field massacres. I think what mass graves of killing people, civilians, children, all that stuff. But they were hooked on speed, meth, and all types of stuff like that. I don't know what the Japanese people were doing, while at the same time cutting into people, harming women and children. Oh fuck! I don't want to think about what they were doing to babies. Go.
And that is so much worse than a group of people who were just following their orders and turned off their ears. This guy still had ears, he was still listening, and he kept following those orders. Along that same note of kind of the illusion of us versus them fading, there was one, I believe he was a guard there. Some said guard, some said he was like a research assistant. Someone who wasn't a high-ranking researcher named Yoshio Sudo, who got infected with the plague while he was there because, you know, everyone's dealing with these volatile diseases, so one of the workers gets infected. So they cut that guy open. Like, I guess they figured, well, he's a test subject now, we're not going to let him go to waste. Who cares if he's Japanese? And they sliced him open too. It's interesting, while kind of the Japanese government's idea was, well, we're more important than they are, so they can suffer. But we see these glimpses of the Japanese who are infected being treated the same as everyone else who's infected, and also the Japanese recognizing that these people have emotions and feelings, and it makes the situation so much more scary in the end. And I think one of the reasons it is so scary is because, again, we read a lot of stories like this, and it's comforting to think, oh, well, if they just knew better, right? Like, oh, well, maybe if they didn't have to struggle for resources as much, or maybe if they maybe if they were allowed to experience humanity from this other side that they seem to hate so much, maybe then, you know, they wouldn't have had to do the awful things they did, right? It's easier to read a lot of history that way. But you see instances like that, and it kind of, it's dreadful, the idea that, sure, they had all that, it didn't change anything. Near the end of World War II, the Japanese government got desperate and decided to rely on Unit 731 for some kind of drastic measure against the United States. So, using the bubonic plague research that the Japanese had figured out, again by testing it on residents of China, the Japanese government put together a plan called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan for this was to release the bubonic plague on San Francisco, and the attack was scheduled to take place on September the 22nd of 1945. But this plan never came to fruition because just over a month before September 22nd, America dropped the atomic bombs on Japan and ended the war. In these final days of the war, the members of Unit 731 realized that the war courts would not err in their favor and decided to destroy whatever evidence they could. And of course, this evidence began with the prisoners, who were forced to either ingest poison or be shot before the facility itself was set on fire and most of the documents and research destroyed. And as mentioned, no one who ever entered Unit 731 as a prisoner ever walked out. When Douglas MacArthur came to Japan after the war was over, he immediately heard whispers of things like human experimentation. After tracking down Ishii and the other leaders of Unit 731, they confessed that some degree of human experimentation took place, but wouldn't give MacArthur specific details. MacArthur threatened that if the remnants of 731 don't comply with the United States, then the United States would allow the Russians to judge the members of Unit 731.
Yeah, the Japanese definitely didn't want that, because I'm pretty sure they was afraid of some, you know, backlash after the Russo-Japanese War, which is when this was after, you know, the United States, I think Commodore Perry, Matthew Perry, it might not be Matthew, but he forced the gates of, you know, metaphorical gates of Japan open, and this led to them forcing themselves to do the Meiji Restoration after kicking out the shogun and all that type of stuff, so they could modernize their military and their society to keep up with Western countries and not be a colony like the rest of the world. This eventually led to some, you know, hatred or, you know, heat between Russia and Japan. And Russia was just expecting to just walk all over them because they saw them as inferior because they were Japanese and Asian. So stupid. And rightfully, they got blown up and embarrassed by the Japanese. So I could definitely see why the Japanese were like, okay, come on, all right, calm down. You don't gotta bring in the Russians. Don't bring in the communists. So we can figure this out. We can come to a deal, because they already want some backlash. Honestly, it's surprising they didn't invade Japan, or from my understanding, they might have like started initiating the invasion of Japan after they defeated Nazi Germany. But it is kind of interesting that during the whole World War II, Russia never really invaded Japan, but partially because they was so occupied with Germany.
Now, I don't know if you know this, but especially right after World War II, you much wanted to be in a United States tribunal than a Russian tribunal, because Americans typically ended with prison sentences and Russians ended with
Death.
rope. So, a deal was struck between MacArthur and the head researchers of Unit 731 that said if the researchers of 731 turned over all of their data to the United States, then they would be given full immunity. And of course, both sides agreed to that deal. Now, a couple things. The reason this deal was done is because, one, and most importantly, America was afraid of what might happen if the Russians, who shortly after World War II began the Cold War and all of that, or the Cold War began between the United States and Russia, I should say. America was afraid of what would happen if the Russians got their hand on all of that information. So it was more so done not so America could have biological weapons. I mean, we're not dropping plagues on populated cities, at least. That's what they want you to think. But really, it wasn't so much that we could have the information as much as we didn't want the Russians to have the information. And the other reason that the deal was taken is because, not really that I think it would have changed anything, but most of the details of what happened weren't known until decades after World War II ended. Like most of the stuff I read about came out in confessions in the 70s and 80s. And while MacArthur knew that there was some level of human experimentation, I mean, the data he was handed talked about how long it took for the researchers to witness someone dying of hypothermia, right? Like, he couldn't have been totally dumb to it, but at least the brutality and methods of it, they probably weren't aware of at the time. Not that I think that would have stopped them from it, but maybe they wouldn't have given full immunity.
Yeah,
maybe I just
so.
like to think they wouldn't have given them full immunity if they knew.
Wait, I mean, but they did, from my memory or my understanding, they gave German scientists free immunity to work on the space program and, military technology and all that other stuff. So it's very possible, but this is a very different situation only because it's about the actual information that the Japanese have. There is claims right now, it could be just conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat type stuff, but they have biological weapons in Ukraine right now today. But even still, like, I completely understand why the United States would make that deal. Because if you're looking forward like a decade, or even like a year or so, you think you might have a war with Russia, Soviet Russia. The last thing you want is to have Soviet Russia, a government that shown repeatedly they don't give a damn about their own civilians, to let them have human experimentation plans and data and some type of stuff they could work on to possibly use against you or their own people in testing. Like, seriously. Like, you really don't think if Russia had access to the material, they want to try maybe do some of the stuff in the gulags? I don't put it past Stalin. I don't put it past the people that listen to Stalin, has to do everything he says, or risk going to jail and be in the gulag themselves. So that makes absolute sense to me.
Knew the full extent, but whatever, it still happened. Now keep in mind, to the public at that time, none of this had ever happened. To the Japanese government, to the Chinese, Unit 731 was a crazy conspiracy theory if you thought anything weird was happening out there, because it's just for public health and lumber for some reason. So whenever the immunity deal was made, part of the deal was that America would keep up the lie that nothing ever happened at Unit 731, and all of the members of Unit 731 could change their name, and America wouldn't release their identities to the public. So after America makes this whole plea deal with them, eventually Russia shows up, and they actually have a trial for some of the members of Unit 731, and as you can imagine, didn't care to consult the US over it. So Russia holds a trial, and they end up getting 12 people who they can confirm were in Unit 731, and the sentences for those 12 who were found guilty were 2 to 25 years in a labor camp, of which the most any of them served was 7 years. Now, if you know anything about Russian history with war...
The 7 years means that they got out, or did they just die because they got worked to death? We're talking about Soviet Russia labor camps.
War crimes. The idea that these men weren't shot or hanged is absurd. Especially that they ended up just serving 2 to 7 years, respectively for different people. That is insane. How did that happen?
Well, if
you'll remember, The American deal with the Russians wasn't made official until like the 80s, and some researchers we're going to talk about, put in the work and made it come to be. So the fact that the Russians show up, they talk to the Japanese for a while, and only a few of the 731 researchers get like 5 years in prison, it is pretty much guaranteed that the Russians made a deal with the Japanese, very similar to the deal America made with them. So at the end of the day, this group of people who were monstrous, demons even, committed a massive amount of bloodshed and misery. And then when the going got tough, they sold that bloodshed and misery to the highest bidder and got off scot-free. So ain't that a kick in the pants? Now again, none of this was public information, and it would have stayed that way if it wasn't for the work of various Japanese historians. See, again, Unit 731 for years was like a boogeyman. There would be a researcher come out in like the 60s or 70s talking about how the project was real, or they were a part of it and they can attest to it. And they would get laughed off by the media, saying that they were just some crazy conspiracy theorist. Historians pulled various records in Japan that supported the government's sanctioning of Unit 731. And in 1983, a historian published his findings and was told by the Japanese Board of Education that he should take those findings out of textbooks because it's not backed historically. So these historians went to the United States, and now, because everything's declassified, went through various records and found MacArthur's immunity deals and the records that he got directly from the Unit 731 experiments, and were able to bring those records back to Japan, show them to the Board of Education, and say, it's real, it's all right here. And from then on, the Japanese government slowly began to admit fault in the Unit 731 experiments. Through the 1990s, the Japanese government finally acknowledged that it was a real thing, but not the specifics of what the researchers actually did. The most recent development of Unit 731 was in 2018, when the Japanese government named the 3,607 researchers who were a part of the unit. And as you can imagine, between all 3,607 of those names, they're all either dead or have disappeared. Shiro Ishii, if you'll remember, the leader of all of Unit 731, died on October the 9th of 1959 from laryngeal cancer, never experiencing judgment on this side of eternity for his role in the Japanese war crimes. And Unit 731, like I said at the beginning of this video, is depressing. There's no two ways about it. There's no happy ending. There's no good side to it. It was a group of people committed atrocities, and they got away with it, effectively. And there's no polish I can give that. But what I can give polish is that this story was almost entirely lost for history. If you were from World War II, from these events happening up until like 1984, when it finally became official, the people who died never died, at least publicly. Their names were just lost as some of the many names lost in World War II. And they were just a statistical anomaly because governments didn't want to acknowledge the atrocities that they had once condoned, or that the forerunners before them had condoned. And of course, obviously, I don't mean any of my, critiques of the Japanese government during World War II to apply to now. But again, that was less than a century ago. It's hard to think about that humanity is capable of that kind of evil and that kind of justification for that kind of evil. But the point I want to bring out, the one light in all of it, I could say, is the people who would not be quiet. The people who kept learning, who kept digging, and now we have names of the perpetrators, and we have death of the victims. We have cause of the victims. And while it doesn't make it right, and the suffering still happened, it gives some meaning to it. Their names are not simply lost, they were taken. And hopefully by understanding why they were taken and what great evil led to it, we can prevent tragedies like that from ever happening again. And like I said, Unit 731 is a heavy story, but it's one that I think should be told. Not one I enjoy telling. I didn't have a good time recording this, I'll be honest. But it's one that needs to be. And I'm just a lowly YouTuber. I'm no one important. I'm no one special. But hopefully you got something out of this. Or at least you have more depressing knowledge to terrorize your friends with, which in that case, win-win. But either way, if you got something out of this, or you just like to be miserable like I do, I guess, that's cool. And I just want to say thank you for watching. Thank you all so much for sticking around and watching the video. I know I promised that the Ted Kaczynski video would be next, but that video is becoming a much larger project with a lot of really cool things that I've never done before, and it's taking more time. So hopefully whenever it does come out, you all will be excited and it will be worth the wait. I hope you like that teaser in the ad, and hopefully that made the rest of this video not as depressing. But if you made it this far, I appreciate it, and I hope it wasn't that much of a bummer. And I want to emphasize, while I talk about a lot of the disturbing and worst parts of humanity, I am talking about the outliers. I am talking about the strange parts. Humanity, just as capable as it is for infinite evil, is capable of infinite good. And don't let yourself get in a headspace about how terrible the world can be, but get in a space about how great it can be as well. I recently, I'll brag a little bit, my fiance Kayla just graduated with her doctoral, so she's a doctor now, and that's incredible, and I'm proud of her. And it helps seeing people like her, people who strive, people who have power and diligence and strength. And it really is easy to take your mind off the terrible when there's so much good to be found. So again, I hope it didn't get you that sad. And if I did, I'm sorry. But I hope that you enjoyed a shorter video for now. But like I said, TED on the way. There will probably be another video in between this one and the TED one, because like I said, that's becoming a big one. But expect the TED video in June, and hopefully you enjoyed that. But until then, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.
Oh man, that was a heavy video to watch. Like I said over and again, like I watch a lot of military stuff, ancient, modern, in between battles, such and so forth, and that stuff is always grisly. Especially more modern ones when you have artillery and gas and all that horrible stuff that's in World War One. Or even still the ancient stuff, you have like swords and spears and arrows, and people getting cut up or ran over by horses, or elephants getting stomped on by elephants. Just all types of mess up stuff that happen to people in these battles. But still, this stuff just people just being evil, experimenting on each other because you see them as less than somehow, even though you claim at the start that you want to help them, that you're better than the Westerners, than the Europeans that don't care about them. You claim to be better than the colonizers, but you do 20 times, 100 times worse than they ever did to the same people that you claim to be a part of. The Greater Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere is what Japan called it before they started invading people. But it was nothing more than a lie to cover up their need for resources and to exploit people, but they try to act better than others. I don't know, it just really makes you think about the stuff people can do or will do if they think they're justified or they feel that you're less than them. And that's why I appreciate stories like this being talked about. That's why I love history, because these stories need to be told and need to be known by people. History is nothing but stories, but it's more interesting because it's real life. It's about people just like you and me. You can't just be thinking, oh, I can't imagine myself like them, I could never be them. In a way you can, depending on the story or the person that you're talking about. And that's why I love history. But even with the good of history, you have bad. You have Japanese war crimes, you have Nazi war crimes, you have war crimes in Yugoslavia, the Tutsis and stuff in Africa when they had the whole civil war, killing, massacring people. You have child soldiers in Africa across the world. You used to have slavery across the world, including in Africa, the Middle East, such and so forth. The world isn't a pretty place. That's why I'm always about, just cutting back your stress, being grateful for what you have. Because I live in a Western country. I don't go through suffering like these people went through. I've been lucky enough to not have to go through a major war. That's something that people in certain generations of this country can't say. But that's something that also people my age or younger can't say in their own lives right now. If they live in the Middle East, like Syria or, Iraq, Afghanistan, they didn't choose to be born there. They were just born there. And they just have to suffer in the war zone. Seeing people die around them, bodies burning, people being all types of assault, stuff that I don't even want to go into, stuff that I only know about because of listening to Army veterans like Tim Kennedy and such and so forth like that. These stuff still does happen. People don't want to talk about it, people don't want to listen to it, and people want to act like it's just over, but it's not. People are capable of horrible things, but also good things. Luckily, we have good people. I think there's a lot more good people on this planet than bad. And if you think that's not true, I'm just of the opinion that people who was watching this video, however many it may be in the future in total, I'm willing to say a lot more of them was disgusted, was getting sick, hated everything they heard about what the Japanese did, compared to the ones that was callous about it, loved it, and wish it was a part of it. I think at the end of the day, most people have empathy, even if it's kind of hard because, politics, soy society stuff, and all this other bullshit we argue about. At the end of the day, we're still humans, but that could be muddy when you have influences on you. Could be from the government, could be social media, could be anything at all. But at the end of the day, you have to make your choices. And I think it's really sad. It's really, really sad, all the people that was lost because of this. Especially the parts when they were talking about like the pregnant woman and children and babies. At that point, I was like, all right, I had to take a long, deep breath, look off into the distance, and just think about prairies of flowers and something positive because my goodness, just doing something like that and just not giving a damn, it's beyond me. I don't want to be in that mindset. I can't even wrap my mind around it. And honestly, I don't want to try to because that's just not me. That just ain't it. I can't deal with that shit. That just evil to me. It's stuff like that that makes you want to go to war. It's stuff like that that makes you want to enlist, go be a soldier, and go fight against these people who do this type of stuff to people. Honestly, I was watching this military video about this veteran talking about his time in Iraq and stuff like that. And he was saying he wanted to be like his grandfather or great great grandfather who fought in World War II, fighting against Nazi Germany, fighting against the Japanese. But he went to Iraq and he realized it wasn't that completely. It was more about money in the industrial complex, the military industrial complex. It wasn't about saving people. It wasn't about overthrowing a tyrannical government, not the same way that Japan and Germany was. It was about selfishness. And he saw his buddies, his friends, good people that he wouldn't have met without the army die because of people not even in the army. Politicians, corporations, people like that make money off of just warfare and suffering and death. I hate those people. And I say that as somebody that loves studying war, studying history, studying the military, all the customs, procedures, tactics, strategy. At the end of the day, I don't like seeing people die or be mistreated. But that's just the world we live in. It's not always bad. Most of it's good, but the evil is there. Always will be, always has been. I don't think anything gonna change it. We just have to be better. Not let it happen and just call it out. Make it be public. I don't know about stuff like this still going on. It's possible. I hope not, but it's possible. Evil exists. And honestly, if they took those plans from Japan, I really don't put it past certain people in our government to do that stuff on American citizens or prisoners of war from other countries. I really don't. I seriously, seriously don't. Especially after reacting to the other video when they were talking about harming American civilians to have a war with, I think, Mexico or somebody like that. It was just, oh no, it was Cuba. It was Cuba. They wanted to do the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then members of the military staff under JFK wanted to plant bombs and do disinformation propaganda cases and plans in the United States against United States citizens to give some type of credence or casus belli to go to war with Cuba. It's really sad and messed up when you let corruption go through. And I don't think it's just a capitalist thing. It's not just a communist thing. It's a people thing. You need to watch over your governments, your politicians, and who you have in power, no matter who it is. But that's just me. This is a very heavy video, so I'm probably gonna watch something nice with sunshine and rainbows and I don't know. But it's something that's not involving children being brutalized and messed up. Yeah, I'm not really on that. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. This is an extra long video. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.